Well, here we are again, this time with Jay Stanford again. Jay, I appreciate you coming back a second time. And I felt it was really necessary because last time you went back through, well, I did as well, the history between the food bank and the city, and especially as it circled around that Curb Hunger food drive, which used to be the Blue Box food drive, and all the different changes that happened there. And now we have another one coming up. And I thought before we get into this concept of climate change and what the city is doing, I thought maybe we could just recap a bit. So next week is the food drive that we're going to have. And I just wonder if you could take us through that a bit. You're so used to this now. It's been 20 some odd years for you. But what does that look like, this coming food drive?
Well, Glenn, it's the 26th annual London Cares Curb Hunger Food Drive, and it's just amazing that we've been around this long. It shows that there's still a tremendous need in the community. But equally important, though, is that to address that need is that this is a partnership that comes forward every year.
Yeah.
We've got some organizations like Tri Recycling, Miller Waste Systems, Budweiser Gardens that have been with us for years. The market, all these folks doing their part, Joe Cools helping us to help the food bank. But more importantly, is basically we're helping Londoners. So on June 8th, we'll be launching the 26th annual. And I think, Glenn, what some people realize is that it's the last food drive heading into the summer months.
Yeah.
And very important to help you and your colleagues at the food bank to stock those shelves over the summer months when donations tend to they're a little bit lower. And we know that. But the key part, and this is what we talked about last week, is the evolution of the food drive. And this is the only one that's heading into the summer months, which is the growing season. So it became a natural fit as this program evolved to get into that growing momentum and more nutritious foods. What can be more nutritious than something that comes out of your garden, my garden, comes out of the community garden, or the gardens right at the London Food Bank? And that is what this food drive is really morphed into. And I think that is just wonderful because this is where we remain different than all the other food drives because we're the only one happening in the summer months.
Yeah. No, that's right. And, if people can help out, we'd certainly appreciate it. And each year, as these things go along, it becomes easier for people to donate online and direct that towards fresh food or whatever it is that we need to do. So we have options now that we didn't used to have 20 years ago, right? Which makes it easier for people to give.
Well, it does. And, when we talk about fresh food, one of the highlights of this program has been the evolution of the Community Refresh program.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to talk about that again, because it is a nice segue into what we're talking about today. So think about it. So grocery stores for years, unfortunately, when products were either hitting their expiry date or their best before date, or just the shelves needed fresh food, items were pushed out the back door. And that back door meant going off to landfill here in London.
Yeah.
So you folks in, I guess it was 2017, worked with Food Banks Canada on a program to rescue that food. And that's such a wonderful term because think about it, it's through no fault of its own, it's going out the back door to landfill. So what happened? Over 20 grocery stores in London, I guess representing about 6 or 7 chains, just wonderful, got together and said, we're going to rescue that food. We're going to make sure that it is diverted back to the food bank. And so in 2017, I guess you got started with a handful of grocery stores. Now we're well over 20. But I love the numbers, Glenn. And let me just, I'm going to look at my notes here. I don't like to do that. But when you start looking at the amount that has been recovered, 807,000 kilograms. So in pounds, that's about 1.8 million pounds. But when you think of the value, that was heading out the back door to landfill. And there's a cost with transporting there. There's a cost with tossing it into a landfill site. Not to forget the other thing, that item, that amount of food is worth well over $4.7 million. So when you save that, that's going back into the community. And that's where the food bank comes in.
Yeah.
But I'm wearing a green shirt today, Glenn. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the environment and connect that segue before I hear back from you, though, is that environmentally, that food has all consumed energy in its creation.
Yeah.
It's gone through water in its creation, growing the food. Of course, there's transporting it from the farmers' fields and other parts of the world to get it to London. So that's all consuming energy. So now we're not wasting that energy. And in fact, the energy, when I look at my notes, that energy creates in the order of 1,900 tons of greenhouse gases. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's put it into a simple term. We have now avoided the creation of 1,900 tons of greenhouse gas, or the same amount of greenhouse gas generated by 120 cars that are no longer driving in London now. Mm-hmm. So that, becomes quite impactful. The other way of looking at that from a water consumption perspective, that's over 900 Olympic swimming pools of water that is now not wasted. Yeah. That's the key part, not wasted. It is now being consumed by people who can use that nutritious food right here in London.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And, you've been a pretty innovative fella, so has your department and your staff, and we've learned that over time. But it's interesting when you look at your title now at the city, Jay, you almost run out of ink writing it down. But it's climate change, the environment, and solid waste management. And it's interesting that climate change comes first in all of that. What are the changes that you have seen in your 27 years there that have really brought climate change more to the fore? I presume that's not just for London, but for municipalities across the country. What's changed there?
Well, you step back in time, people thought recycling was the answer, right? And then there were cleaners who did a lot more. They helped to protect the natural environment. Yeah. But I think over the last 20 years, people have realized, we used to talk about global warming, and that's a term, it's still used, but it's about our changing climate. And our changing climate is now attributed to our consumption of fossil fuels. Yeah. And this is not just happening in parts of the world, it's happening around the world. And we are seeing devastation in some parts of the world. And these are disasters that are occurring that are being attributed to climate change. Now, for some people here in London, they might not quite get the connection. But you know what? There's actually a very strong connection with severe weather, climate change, and what's happening here in London. We are seeing increases in temperature. Like, just look what's occurring just this week. We don't normally get 30-degree days in May. That's also causing more drought-like conditions. We are seeing more flooding that occurs. Now, the flooding that occurs in London, there was a time when flooding was in the spring. We're now actually seeing flooding occurring in January and February because of the melting that occurs, and then the weather patterns change around. We're also seeing windstorms that are extremely significant. And in fact, just in the last 10 days, we've had some major issues, not only here in London, but across Ontario with windstorms and I believe it's tornadoes touching down. These are all signs of severe weather and a changing climate. So it's right here in London. So we all owe it to ourselves to be paying a lot more attention, not only for Londoners' benefit, our future generations, but also to recognize around the world there is suffering that's taking place that is tied back to climate change now.
Yeah. And just, I think, was it in April or March, the city passed the Climate Emergency Action Plan. I'm sure you were involved in a lot of that, Jay, because climate change is the beginning of your title. But what went into that? Like, I would imagine there was all sorts of different dimensions that finally resulted in that approval. But what kind of work went into that?
Well, it's interesting. This is where working closely with the community, residents, the business community is so vitally important. And making sure that we're tapping into many different aspects of the community. It was over 2 years in the making. And we did this during the pandemic, so most of the work was done online. But we managed to hear from many different Londoners on what their needs are towards climate change, what their aspirations are, what their concerns are. And in many ways, we heard from them speaking about others who some voices that aren't heard. There are many people under climate change who are, well, they're disproportionately impacted. Because let's face it, not everyone lives the same in London. Some are living very well. Some are living in much more difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
There are some people who are consuming resources at a much higher level than others. This is why climate change impacts people differently, and as well, the impacts can be felt differently just in your own lifestyle.
Yeah.
So we had to include all of that in designing a plan that would make sense for London. And in fact, we came up with three key goals. And the first one was handed to us by a municipal council quite some time ago. They said we want to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions
Yeah.
by the year 2050. That's 30 years away. It sounds like a long time, but it's not in the scheme of things because action's required now. They also, and the community agreed and council agreed, we've got to become more resilient. And we've got to become more resilient not only to flooding and the warmer temperatures, but also to things like poverty.
Yeah.
We've got to build systems to take care of our own locally. We cannot rely on food coming in from South America in the future. It's going to be too cost prohibitive, and it has impacts coming in. We've got to grow more food locally, not only in London, but in Southwestern Ontario. And the third goal, a very, very important one, and I don't say this lightly, it's bringing everyone along. And when I say that, we've got to care about everyone. People that are in a very strong, positive place, they have financial wealth, they have strong stability. There are those on the other side and everything in between. We must care about everyone, and we do, but we've got to actually demonstrate that in a bigger and broader way, because not everyone has the same lifestyle and impact from a climate change perspective, because they're not consuming the same amount of resources. Therefore, some people are clearly going to have to do more work than others, but that's part of being a strong community.
So it was passed, when was it, March or April? So just,
April of this year,
yeah.
a
So,
very big, and it was unanimous, Glenn.
yeah.
How often do you see that at municipal council?
Yeah.
Not all that often on
No,
something this important.
that's true. We could go into that a bit, but we won't. But you're right. So that's a great thing. I do know that I'm wondering how community groups responded to it. I know that they would have had, being able to speak to it as you were planning it. But I know as a food bank, for instance, when we suddenly decided to do the greenhouse or the green walls, and we'll hear about those again next week at the press conference. As we decided to do those, there were a lot of environmental groups and neighborhood groups and others that were very curious as to why would the food bank be doing that. We had suddenly kind of entered into a field that they have been working in for over 2 decades. They really, really believe in it. They worked in it in a time when not too many people were very interested, including governments, perhaps even food banks. And so all of a sudden they saw the food bank come along and get involved in a fairly substantial way. And I will say overall, the response to that has been helpful. I mean, they felt that, although food banks aren't the answer to everything, they felt when it comes to urban agriculture and things like that, the food bank taking a lead with what it could there was helpful. How
Mm-hmm.
did those groups and others respond, perhaps even businesses, respond to the Climate Emergency Action Plan once it was passed? Did you get any feedback?
Well, it overall very, very positive.
Okay.
I think because the concerns are legitimate, people recognize that London is in the middle of all of this, along with other municipalities across Canada and North America.
Yeah.
Therefore, we've got to do our part. We've got to do what we're calling our fair share. So community groups, of course, and environmental community groups always want to do more, and they want to push, push, and push. And that's wonderful. And we need that. Businesses, some are doing exactly that. Others, they need to be nudged, and sometimes nudged quite hard, because it's not their main mandate. But what we've seen here in London, and when we've checked with our friends at the London Economic Development Corporation, and they're tracking the business community,
Yeah.
it's well over 60% of the top 85 employers in London now have stated sustainability and climate change objectives on their websites. So these are signals, positive signals, that the business community is getting it, and there's many that are actually leading that. Same can be said for community groups. There are many that are doing their main purpose and now are adapting or adopting climate change principles into their daily work. And some are doing just a wonderful job. There's so many right now involved with the urban agricultural sector, and it is just wonderful. We have many involved on the mobility sector, and mobility, people who want to encourage more walking, more cycling. So these groups are all doing their part, and there are obvious groups that are going to want to support the Climate Emergency Action Plan. What we have to remember, though, Glenn, and the food bank's a perfect example, we encourage people to get involved and get out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
Their comfort zone is what they might do as a community group on a day-to-day basis or a monthly basis. And it might be food poverty. Let's use that as an example. There is a climate change component that might not be there on the surface, but climate change is among everything that we do. Therefore, whether it's food poverty, urban agriculture, or associations dealing with baseball and hockey, pickleball, whatever it might be, all these groups have a role to play, in part because they're getting together as an organization, they're doing their primary business, but at the same time, let's look at hockey, for example. There's no reason why there's not more carpooling occurring in hockey. You don't all need to drive individual vehicles to the hockey practice. So what do? Make sure that there's only a couple of vehicles going to that game or that practice. Those are the same principles that apply across many different associations. Do your primary business, but always make sure you've got sustainability and climate change built into your community agendas. That is how we're going to strengthen London, when it's something that we're constantly talking about and constantly promoting and constantly taking action on.
Yeah. You know, Jay, back in 2008, I was asked by Al Gore, along with 100 other Canadians, to come down to Montreal. Now, he had not too long before that won the Academy Award for Inconvenient Truth. And he had come to Canada because he felt Canada was such a good example or a potential for what we could do. But what ended up coming up over and over again in that weekend was, well, the problem with, though, doing all of that in a democracy is that people see that there's a need to do it, but then we end up electing governments that are sometimes at the various jurisdictions. A provincial government might be for it, but a federal government might not be. Or there might be a municipal government that is not for it, or is trying to get something going with it and is having trouble getting funding or attention for it from the province. Now, last week I asked you a personal question. If you get discouraged in some of your work, and boy, you came right back at me and let me know what you thought of that you love your job and you think it's great. But do you sense that within the three jurisdictions that we're speaking of here, do you sense that there is more of a harmonization beginning to happen that transcends a particular election, where a particular party is being elected and then could maybe throw it all into disarray? Do you sense it's getting better, or is that something that still worries you?
Definitely still worries me.
Yeah.
There are some days, Glenn, where I do see the positive alignment.
Yeah.
And then there are days where all of a sudden you start reading policies that clearly conflict. And the challenge is, of course, that sends a mixed message, not only to residents and citizens, also to businesses. So definitely there's more work required on alignment. And in fact, a big part of our climate emergency action plan is to actually work on that alignment. We spend a lot of time making sure here at City Hall and across all the services that we do to push for that alignment in our strategic planning and also in our upcoming multi-year budget planning. So we had some work to do. We've also stated in our plan that we really encourage the province and the federal government. They work together hand in hand on many things, and on other things they don't. And you know that from your experience. But the key part here is that it'll never be perfect, but what remains constant? People and businesses. We are always going to be here beyond those 3 and 4 year terms.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have to look at things holistically and lay out plans over a longer period of time. And what we've done in our climate emergency action plan is that we've set milestone targets. Our first big milestone is 2030. So about 8 to 9 years from now. So that will cross over a couple terms of council. It'll cross over a couple terms of provincial and federal governments. But at the same time, if we are aligned and showing progress, I think that's going to send a very positive message. and that eventually provincial and federal governments will say there are certain things that we should just all agree on, that we stay the course.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to strive for, because that is what's going to drive that new business investment. They need to have certainty over a longer period of time.
Yeah. I do remember, in my time as an MP in Ottawa, that certain municipalities would come up and lobby. I definitely remember Nahid Nenshi from Calgary coming up, and they would lobby for climate change stuff, the help that they needed, whether it was in transportation or whatever, around climate change, and they wanted the federal government's assistance. And they came up armed with the Chamber of Commerce, with the University of Calgary, as well as University of Alberta in Edmonton. They came with a whole bunch of different citizen action groups, urban leagues. So they had a vast array, and they took up a large swath of the hotel that was near there. And so when they met with the federal officials, I mean, they came really ready, and everybody was there. The federal officials realized as well, hey, we can't slough this one off. So it wasn't
Right.
just a mayor that came up and said, I need some funding, right? Or it wasn't just an activist group that comes up and says that you need to do more. There was this gathering of forces within these communities. Vancouver was another one that was even bigger than the Calgary one. But that's, I think, to some degree, what has to be done as well as we go up to Queen's Park or as we go up to Ottawa, is that they see that all of these different sectors within our communities are doing the work. They're coming together, they're finding a way to harmonize their selective interests and bring them together. But then we have to take that show on the road, right? We have to get up to Ottawa, we have to get up to Queen's Park and say, look, we mean it as a community. This covers everybody in our community. I hope we see more of that in the future. I presume municipalities are doing that, correct?
We are. And items like climate change, affordable housing,
Yeah,
uh, poverty, food insecurity, these are items that we should not be debating between levels of government.
yeah,
We need to acknowledge we need solutions, and we also need to acknowledge we all have to work together on this.
yeah,
And we see some very strong positive signs of that. And Glenn, with the Climate Emergency Action Plan, the word I often use there is that we've taken some fair bit of time in the development of it to work on alignment. And now we've got to put that alignment to action. For a great example is that we've actually are in the process of signing a memorandum of understanding with Western University to work on projects together, to
mm,
apply for grants together, where
yeah,
local government, the expertise of the professors and faculty, and the expertise of the students, those future generations, can all be tied together to tackle challenges and, more importantly, create opportunities. And that type of alignment is really key. We're going to be working on that with Fanshawe College as well.
mm,
And we've already started really good discussions with the Chamber of Commerce, the London Economic Development Corporation, to get those kinds of alignments
yeah,
to help attract new businesses to London. Because the new businesses want to arrive in places that are already well established with respect to sustainability. So we also find that it'll be a competitive advantage that London has with all this alignment. And so challenges are out there in all municipalities, but when you've got a collection of good people working together on solutions, that then becomes basically a discriminator, a positive discriminator on why I should come to London. So
yeah,
we want to harness that kind of energy.
yeah. Jay, your green shirt suits you today. Thank you so much for all the leadership that you've shown. What I find fascinating is when, you've been there at the city for 27 years, the food bank has been around for 35 years. But when we bumped into one another early on in the food bank's history, we were talking about fitting together this idea of poverty, food security, fresh food, recycling, those kind of things, citizenship, city governance, and we were trying to fit a lot of those things together. But it seems to me that in recent years, they've all fallen and dovetailed in together. So the idea of, for instance, food not being wasted and going towards families that are struggling in food insecurity, that's just a given now. And people pull those things together. The idea, I think, of food security as far as providing a lot of our own food, so we're not stuck with having to depend on international supplies and other
Right.
things. I mean, that's a natural thing that happens between groups like the food bank or businesses and the city. But all of those things, I think, have become, they seem to fit better than they did when it was 2 decades ago. We tried to mold them and put them together, and it was a bit of a struggle even in messaging, right?
Right.
Now it's not. It's much easier. And I really want to thank you for that. You know, you've been around for over 2 decades, almost three. But for people who've been wanting to bring about this food security, fighting poverty, and dealing with climate change and other things, you've always been an open person at the city towards those things. And if your file would have been changed all the time and then you got shoved to something else, we might not have seen the successes we've seen lately. So I just want to thank you and your staff, because we know your staff really well. Thank you, all of you, for putting that kind of effort into it, and for all that you've done. It's been the consistency I have felt that's brought about the major developments here that has happened, and you kept in your lane. You just kept pushing it and drawing other people in. And I really want to thank you for that, Jay, because without that consistent leadership, this stuff wouldn't be happening.
Oh, thanks, Glenn. It's very kind. But a key thread through all of that, though, are volunteers.
Yep.
And let's face that, volunteers at the food bank, volunteers in all those community groups, um, they don't get recognized enough. But that is, I believe, one of the biggest strengths that London has to offer. We have volunteers everywhere.
Yeah.
And as we move forward,
Yep.
we hear that term, volunteer burnout. Well, better days are just around the corner. This summer, they're going to start. So things are going to get better. And volunteers, I can never say thank you enough for all
Hmm.
that work. And
Yeah.
for you, yourself, and Jane, and all the volunteers at the food bank, the relationship has been wonderful. And I look at every day as a fresh day. And it's
Hmm.
a fresh day. And I'll tell you what, I'm looking forward to next week when we get to launch the 26th annual London Cares Curb Hunger Food Drive.
And our partnership continues. Thank you, Jay. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me for the conversation.
Yep.